The life of Nazi soldiers on the Eastern Front was an abyss of suffering compared to the relative normality that still existed in Germany during the early years of the war. Many of these soldiers, most of them young men between 18 and 25 years old, wrote letters home that reflected a stark contrast between the harshness of the front and memories of civilian life. They described endless marches in temperatures as low as -30 degrees Celsius, constant hunger, filth, and an ever-present sense of fear. The daily life of Nazi soldiers on the Eastern Front was hell on earth. Their diet consisted of meager rations of hard bread, turnip soups, or canned meat, although they often had to loot villages to survive. They slept in trenches, improvised bunkers, or simply under the open sky, facing extreme temperatures and diseases caused by the lack of hygiene, such as typhus and dysentery. Receiving letters and packages from Germany was one of the few comforts amid the chaos. Some tried to maintain small routines, such as shaving or symbolically celebrating Christmas, but everything was overshadowed by the brutality of the front, especially after 1943, when, following Stalingrad, the war became a hopeless inferno. Echoes of youth, the call to war. Operation Barbarossa was the largest invasion attempt in history, and in a surprise attack, somewhere around 3 million soldiers crossed the German-Soviet border. That army was carefully assembled, but in these vast numbers it was of utmost importance to draw young people into the Wehrmacht. Although the operation was organized in complete secrecy, the mobilization and the recruitment were much needed to make these formidable numbers. The first ones were veterans from France and the Balkans who were still very young in age. Yet the Nazis needed more soldiers, and although in secrecy, they needed volunteers. Although there weren't any official calls to attack the East, Hitler himself spoke to his generals about the upcoming war until extermination. The world wasn't big enough for the master race and a realm of Judeo-Bolshevism. Only one could win and survive. It all started with the infamous Nazi propaganda. Goebbels mainly insisted on awakening the patriotic feelings among these young men in their late teens. There were ideas to serve and save the country that needed their help. Of course, promises of glory and victory were everywhere, but that wasn't the reality that awaited these soldiers, many of whom were barely out of adolescence. Even experienced soldiers rivaled for their place in the elite Wehrmacht and the SS units to gain prestige. Nazi Germany was very well organized when it came to indoctrinating their young people, and one of the main means of achieving new generations of role model Nazis was the Hitler Youth. This organization became the main recruitment tool. These boys were, from an early age, trained and prepared to be the future soldiers of the Reich. Founded in 1926, it provided soldiers for the Wehrmacht for 15 years, and when the preparation began for Operation Barbarossa, these boys were already convinced and lived with the main idea that the Soviet Union was the ultimate enemy. And in the early morning in the summer, soldier Günter Koschorek remembered in his memoirs 4 decades later, "We were told nothing. There was a strange tension. We cleaned our rifles, we oiled our boots, and then suddenly one morning the officers came and said, 'We march east,' just like that." From that moment everything changed, but the morale, especially among the young ones, was very high. The testimony of one of these boys who joined the 1st Panzer Division showed the pattern of influence on them. His name was Hans Richter, and he remembered later, "When I was called up, I felt like it was my duty. We were told that the Soviet Union was a land of Bolshevik evil and that Germany would liberate the people there. I was excited, and this was my chance to prove myself. I was only 18, but I was convinced that I was going to fight for something bigger than myself." He was just one of many men who did not fully understand what he was signing up for. To be honest, many individuals couldn't comprehend the complexity and the enormous scale of the operation. When the soldiers crossed the border into the Soviet Union, many young recruits, including Richter, were shocked by the realities of war. Among them was Private Kurt Bauer, who was part of the later infamous 6th Army, who was left in shock when he first ran into the Soviet forces. "We were expecting to move quickly, just like in Poland. We were told it would be the same. But when we hit the Soviet defenses, we were stunned. The Russians fought back fiercely and we lost men very quickly. It wasn't like the training, this was a real war. I had no idea what was coming." His words show what the propaganda did to these young soldiers. who had been sold on the idea of swift victories and endless glory. Still, many believed in the cause, fully indoctrinated by the propaganda, ready to fight in the holy war for the protection of the civilization. As the war progressed in the first few weeks, more volunteers arrived, especially in the SS troops, who didn't have strict limits when it came to age. So many young boys joined their ranks. They all became part of a well-organized machine, ready to be the first one to conquer Russian land, now the Soviet Union, since the Middle Ages. The Iron Fist divided, 3 armies, 1 goal. Operation Barbarossa had a codenamed Directive No. 21, but it wasn't just a singular attack. It was a combination of many different offensives that stretched across nearly 3,000 kilometers of land, so the strategy and organization needed to be divided. There were 3 main army groups: Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South. All 3 of these groups had their different objectives, but it all led to a mutual goal: the utter and complete destruction of the Soviet Union. Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, was tasked with conquering the Baltic states and securing Leningrad, the second largest city in the Soviet Union. Army Group Center, the largest and most crucial of the 3, led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was to drive through the heart of Soviet Russia toward Moscow. Meanwhile, Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, aimed to secure the rich oil fields of the Caucasus and Ukraine, vital to Germany's war economy. One of the soldiers in the Army Group Center, Private Erich Weber, remembered how large was their mission. It was a strange feeling. We were just a small part of this enormous operation. I was in the 16th Panzer Division, and our objective was simple: push towards Moscow and crush anything in our way. But the further we went, the more we realized how big this whole thing was. There were other army groups, each with their own objectives, but we all knew it was just one big push eastward. His fellow soldiers in Army Group Center faced the toughest and the most fearsome resistance from the Soviets as they moved toward the Soviet capital. The German army progressed quickly in the first few weeks of the invasion. Another soldier from the Panzer Division in the Army Group Center remembered how fast they moved. His name was Klaus Wagner, and he was sure they would be in Moscow in just a few weeks, but as they advanced further, the resistance increased, and the terrain became much more inhospitable. And the number of the Soviet forces seemed infinite, yet the Germans still progressed. In the southern part of the front, the situation was also in German favor. The goal was very close, as the whole of Ukraine fell under Nazi rule, and the fields of today's Azerbaijan seemed just around the corner. As the world entered 1942, there was just one more city before the final taking of the oil, Stalingrad. Still, there were some troubles among the soldiers who started to realize the lies of the propaganda. They were told to expect welcoming parties from the locals in Ukraine, whom they freed from communism, but they found hostile locals who mostly didn't want anything to do with them. On the shores of the Baltics, the Army Group North was also near their objective. Small states fell under their rule, and Leningrad was cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. But here the conditions for the soldiers were almost unbearable. The region with dense forests, marshy land, and extremely harsh winters influenced Private Karl Müller, who wasn't expecting that. The cold was unbearable. We were told it would be cold, but nobody told us just how bad it would be. The Russians had prepared the land, and we were constantly fighting the swamps, dense forests, and the biting cold. It wasn't the glorious war we had been promised. We were freezing, hungry, and fighting with every inch we advanced. Despite these harsh obstacles, all 3 army groups pushed forward, mostly due to their elite units that paved the way to the glorious first year of the invasion. Blitzkrieg unleashed, the steel and fury of Barbarossa. The success of the Blitzkrieg at the beginning of the invasion was unprecedented, and at the heart of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was the 1st Panzer Division. This unit was designed only for the purpose of speed in delivering rapid blows and cutting the enemy lines. In the early days of the campaign, when we crossed into Soviet territory, the speed was unbelievable. We were moving so fast, and the Soviet defenses just couldn't keep up with us. The tanks were powerful, more advanced than anything the Soviets had, said Private Klein from the 1st Panzer Division. Equipped with the latest Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, the division advanced rapidly, but conditions soon worsened with mud and snow. and the difficulty of keeping supply lines intact. Besides the 1st Panzer Division, Panzer Group II, with Heinz Guderian in charge, advanced the most. Their tanks advanced rapidly through Belarus, encircling huge Soviet forces and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Guderian's deep penetration tactics, fast movement, and use of radios gave German forces a major edge. He even threatened Moscow, but Hitler eventually diverted his panzers south to help encircle Soviet troops near Kyiv. This early progress was impressive, but it stretched supply lines and exposed flaws in the overall strategy. The panzers had been designed for blitzkrieg tactics, and as the days passed, the panzer divisions found themselves slowing down in the war that wasn't going to end soon. Supplies became harder to maintain, and the initial successes began to feel like a burden. For Private Heinz Müller, a member of the 2nd Panzer Division, the weather became the worst enemy. We started in a rush, and it felt like we were invincible, but the further we went, the harder it became. We couldn't keep up with the supply chain, the fuel ran low, and the weather was turning against us. It was tough, and we were not prepared for this kind of fight. Soon, the success of the blitzkrieg was starting to lose its momentum, and as the days dragged on, the initial sense of triumph began to erode. Private Kurt Wagner perfectly described that shift. At first, it felt like we were unstoppable, but soon, we started seeing how many men we were losing. Some tanks broke down, others were destroyed, and we were constantly on the move. It wasn't like the training we had back in Germany. This was a whole different kind of war. We were fighting in places that seemed to go on forever, and the Soviets were more prepared than we thought. As the 1st Panzer Division and others pressed onward, the promises of quick victory and decisive battles proved to be lies. The reality of the Eastern Front hit these soldiers very soon after, and some of the soldiers silently talked among themselves about it. One of them, who worked as a mechanic, knew that the key was in maintaining tanks, which became increasingly difficult. Yet he noticed something new among the soldiers: fear. The whole enthusiasm from the beginning started to fade, and many started to doubt whether this war was worth it. They wanted to go home, but there was no turning back now. The enemy in the mirror, a war of minds. The Nazi propaganda machine managed to convince many people in Germany to join the Nazi ranks and even to join the war effort. But now they had a new task, the most important one. Since the beginning of the Nazi Party, the main enemy was communism, and now the propaganda had to justify the attack. This machine worked tirelessly to shape the perception of the Soviet Union, Stalin, and the communists. In some of the movies that survived the war, and also in the newspaper, the Soviets were portrayed as barbarians with awful regimes, completely opposite to the German civilization. People there were considered subhuman, and the soldiers were demonized. In the Nazi press, the Soviets were described as a collective of monstrous savages, and of course, in alliance with Jewish people. That whole Bolshevik ideology was considered something that needs to be eradicated. There were even propaganda leaflets given to the soldiers. On these papers, there were caricatured Soviet soldiers with exaggerated Mongol features, in some ragged uniforms with primitive weapons. All this was done to justify everything that the German forces did to the Soviet soldiers and civilians, and they were mostly exterminated. They wanted to present it as the battle for existence, and these ideas shaped the mindset of many soldiers on the Eastern Front. The actual truth couldn't be further away, and Private Erich Weiss witnessed it firsthand. When we first crossed the border, we were told that we were fighting an evil empire. We were told they were not even human, that they were a plague on Europe. But when we actually got there, it didn't feel like that. These were people like us, just trying to survive. Many of them fought against us, but others, I saw, were just ordinary people caught up in this nightmare. Still, the propaganda continued. The dehumanization of the Soviets was pushed even further with stories of atrocities and enemy cruelty, although it was the other way around. A propaganda booklet titled Der Bolschewik defined Europe as the Bolshevik, the enemy of Europe, circulated in 1941 to 42. It included highly exaggerated, fake, and stereotypical illustrations of racial types, and claimed the Soviet system intentionally mixed racial groups to destroy European identity, and that's what the Germans are fighting against. So, they weren't the aggressors, they were liberators of Europe. Private Heinrich Müller, from the 6th Army, soon realized the truth. We were told that they were barbaric, that we'd march in and crush them quickly. But once we got deeper into the Soviet Union, I saw that it was far from that. They had their own reasons for fighting, and they weren't just mindless beasts. It was like we were the ones being told lies. They were as human as we were. Besides the battlefield, the cultural differences and clashes between the two cultures started even before the operation itself, and in this clash, propaganda was used the most. Still, when the invading forces met with the Soviet civilians, many of them realized that they wouldn't be welcomed as liberators. Among them was Private Hoffman, who finally understood, after years of indoctrination, that the civilians in Soviet Russia just wanted to survive the war and were highly suspicious of the German army. And many paid for that attitude with their lives. That barbarism, attributed to the Soviets, was shown by the Nazi army, of course, justified by the propaganda. In the Army Group South, Private Schultz remembers mass executions of civilians. Whole villages were burned and people were shot. It felt wrong, but we followed orders. We were in the middle of a war and we were told we were doing the right thing, but looking back, it was terrifying. While many became willing executionists of the Nazi policy, for many soldiers, the Eastern Front became a nightmare that changed their beliefs. The glorious invasion became a battle for survival, and the propaganda had to intensify to continue the illusion of that glory, and the censorship had to be included to silence the voices of the soldiers who saw the battles with their own eyes. The diet from hell, what German soldiers really ate. On the brutal Eastern Front, luck was not on the side of German soldiers. While their enemies received emergency rations designed to be both nutritious and somewhat palatable, they had to endure the infamous Eisern portion, or iron rations. The name seemed to refer not only to the toughness of the food itself, but also to the near-superhuman resilience needed to consume it. Among the most notorious items were hard salted biscuits, so dense that soldiers nicknamed them cement bricks, and canned meat of questionable origin, often sourced from horses. In an environment where hunger was as deadly as enemy bullets, these meager, harsh rations were often the thin line between survival and starvation. The common idea in society is that soldiers spent their days eating canned field rations. However, nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, such emergency meals were reserved for times of extreme necessity. So what did German soldiers eat most of the time? Generally, they consumed hot meals, surprisingly tasty given the circumstances, prepared in field kitchens that accompanied the armies, the so-called Gulaschkanonen, goulash cannons. These bulky, horse-drawn contraptions, as Demet Guzi notes in Food on Foot, a history of eating on trails and in the wild, resembled artillery pieces with a long chimney. When World War II began, the German soldiers' daily ration, Portionsatz, was divided into 3 meals. The first was a rather meager breakfast. The main meal was served at midday, when soldiers consumed roughly half of their total daily calories. To end the day, they had a light dinner that helped them endure until the following morning. As David Westwood explains in his comprehensive work, German Infantryman, 2, Eastern Front, 1941-43, the midday meal accounted for half of the total, the evening meal for 1/3, and the next morning's breakfast for 1/6. At midday, German soldiers typically ate rye bread, various types of meat, including horse meat, soy flour, fish, fresh fruits and vegetables when available to the cooks, potatoes, legumes, powdered pudding, and condensed milk. These meals were usually served hot, often prepared as stews and distributed from the Gulaschkanonen. Breakfast, by contrast, was much simpler. Just a piece of bread, butter or margarine, some jam, and occasionally a slice of sausage, along with the usual imitation coffee. A substitute brewed from nuts or acorns, as real coffee was a rare luxury. Dinner was generally similar to breakfast. Throughout the war, and even before it, food portions issued to soldiers were strictly regulated. As David Westwood notes, different rations were assigned based on the soldier's role. The Ration 1, Verpflegungssatz 1, which contained the most food, was designated for frontline troops. Verpflegungssatz 2 was for occupation and communications units. Verpflegungssatz 3 was for soldiers still stationed within Germany. And finally, Verpflegungssatz 4 was intended for nurses and administrative staff. Unlike in some other armies, the German military prioritized food supplies for those at the front lines. Frontline soldiers received noticeably larger portions than their rear echelon counterparts. For example, members of Verpflegungssatz 1 were allotted 136 grams of meat per day, whereas those assigned to Verpflegungssatz 4 received only 56 grams. A similar, though less dramatic, difference existed with bread: 700 grams for frontline troops compared to 600 grams for office personnel. However, the relentless advance across the fields of old Europe often prevented German troops from transporting their field kitchens. For this reason, the German army relied on a series of rations designed to replace hot meals when cooks were unavailable on the battlefield. The first of these was the marching ration, or Alarmverpflegung. As Chris McNabb explains in Hitler's Armies, A History of the German War Machine, 1939-45, this was a cold meal issued to soldiers on the move, meant to sustain them for no more than 3 or 4 consecutive days. According to McNabb and Westwood, this ration weighed about 987 grams and typically included 700 grams of bread, 200 grams of cold meat or cheese, 60 grams of hard biscuits, 9 grams of coffee or 4 grams of tea, 10 grams of sugar, 6 cigarettes. Although it is commonly referred to today as the iron ration, its actual name was Eiserne Portion, iron portion. The distinction is important. The true iron ration was originally intended for valuable animals like horses. Beyond this curiosity, the Eiserne Portion was a combat ration consisting of canned and packaged food issued to German soldiers, but it could only be consumed with an officer's authorization. When was it permitted? Typically, after several days of living solely on Alarmverpflegung, with no access to hot or cold meals, either due to supply shortages or the unavailability of field kitchens. Only at that moment were commanders allowed to authorize their men to open their iron rations. Otherwise, consuming this emergency ration without permission could result in arrest and severe punishment. In fact, to prevent indiscriminate consumption, these rations were usually distributed just before a unit departed for the battlefield. As historian Douglas E. Nash explains in his dossier, Canned Meat in the German Army's Iron Ration, they were normally issued immediately before a unit's departure into the field and replenished as necessary. Practically speaking, soldiers carried the ration in their Sturmgepäck, standard issue assault pack, along with a type of poncho for protection against the cold. Most experts who have studied the Eiserne Portion agree that it lacked the small luxuries, like candies or chocolate, that were included in the American soldiers' privileged K rations. The iron ration was therefore the purest reflection of the German mentality, focused entirely on practicality. It was designed to pack the maximum number of calories into the smallest possible space. The result was a lightweight ration, but at the cost of significant culinary suffering. As military historian Andrew Robertshaw once remarked to the History Channel, at first glance it looked like the worst of all, but when you actually tasted it, you realized it was much worse. In practice, the iron ration included the following items: 250 grams of Zwieback, hard, salted biscuits, providing the carbohydrate portion of the Eiserne Portion. These were wrapped in waxed paper and totaled around 1,000 calories. They never really expired and lasted a very long time, but the Germans said they were like cement slabs, adds Robertshaw. In fact, soldiers often soaked them in water to soften them and made countless jokes about them throughout the campaign, joking that they could even stop a bullet at point-blank range. 150 grams of canned vegetables, 200 grams of Fleischkonserve or canned meat. It was issued in unmarked tins to conceal its origin. The animals used could range from pigs to horses. To meet the insatiable demand for canned meat, canning plants from all over Germany and the occupied countries were drawn into the war effort. As a result, tins of French meat were mixed with Danish ham, German, Italian, Belgian meat, and even sardines from Morocco, reveals Nash. In practice, the canned meat German soldiers received was bland and tasteless. Due to one of the few markings, the letters AM, soldiers often referred to it sarcastically as Alter Naulersel, old mule, or among Italians as Anissus Mussolini, Mussolini's ass. In reality, AM simply stood for Armeeverpflegung, military food. 25 grams of coffee, 25 grams of salt. The total weight of the iron ration was around 650 grams, 850 grams when packed. There was also a half-ration version that included 200 grams of canned meat and 250 grams of biscuits, weighing about 535 grams with packaging. In operational theaters like the Soviet front, where transporting field kitchens was extremely difficult, soldiers were sometimes issued up to 3 Eiserne Portionen at once. Despite their practicality, the iron rations were not particularly appreciated by troops in the field. Toward the end of the war, in 1944, the army introduced the Großkampfpäcken, extended combat packs, emergency menus similar to the American K rations, which included not only meat and biscuits but also chocolate bars, fruits, candies, cigarettes, and sweet cookies. Echoes in the snow, letters from the front lines. Sergeant Hans Müller from the 1st Panzer Division perfectly describes the shift in morale while the war progressed. When we first arrived, we had so much energy. We were under constant fire and the terrain was difficult. Many of us started to ask if we were really doing the right thing. There were young boys, barely 17 or 18, who couldn't even comprehend what was happening. Some were scared and some tried to push through. Most of these boys missed their families, and for soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front, communication with home was a lifeline. The Feldpost system became one of the most vital parts of the war effort. While tanks rolled east and the mailbags followed the supply lines, sharing words of love, hope, and later, quiet despair. In the moments between combat, soldiers were encouraged to write letters on standardized Feldpost paper, free of any charge. The Nazi war machine believed that these letters would boost morale among the soldiers and also among the civilians back home in Germany. But the words didn't go unchecked. Military censors read every letter before sending it. That was needed because of the pieces of information about moving troops and other military secrets, but also they wanted to prevent any pessimism. Some of the soldiers were even punished for sharing despair. Once cleared, alongside ammunition and rations, letters traveled to Germany where they reached the civilian postal system. Letters were arriving pretty fast, in war circumstances, some in just a few days. It was different when the packages went the other way around. These packages from home with chocolate, cigarettes, or warm socks followed the same route, but sometimes it was difficult to reach the final destination. In the early stages of Barbarossa, when the German advance seemed unstoppable, such packages arrived fairly regularly. But as the war dragged on and the Eastern Front grew more chaotic, fewer of them made it through. After Stalingrad, many simply stopped coming, and these letters were the only glimpses of normal lives back home for these soldiers. In his wartime memoir, A Stranger to Myself, Private Willie Peter Rees wrote, "The letters we sent were like whispers from hell to a world that couldn't understand." In his memoirs, we could see the shift in morale and the change of tone in letters that became much darker, although the censorship still worked. Soldiers wrote about snow, cold, hunger, missing home. These words were written cautiously, and some were written in code, some left things unsaid. But they wrote. While reading these letters, it is easy to notice the difference in date. Private Otto Fischer from the 6th Army wrote in one of the early letters, "I'm on the move again, heading east, but we've made quick progress. The Soviets are weak, and we are advancing rapidly. It's cold, but we are strong. Don't worry about me. I'm fine, and we'll be back home before Christmas." A few months later, there was another letter also arriving from the Army Group South, this one written by Private Becker. In his words, Becker describes unbearable conditions, mud, cold, and hunger. Many in his unit were sick, many wounded, and many left their bones there. He finished in a pessimistic tone about a large number of Soviet soldiers and unsure for how long he could continue. This letter home wasn't an isolated case of sharing personal feelings. It was concrete evidence of the morale of the soldiers. In December 1941, a letter was sent containing words that perfectly described these feelings. "We're stuck in the middle of nowhere with no reinforcements and hardly any supplies. The officers keep promising that help is on the way, but no one believes them anymore." Even the ones who wrote with optimism, like Private Müller, changed their minds, even questioning their superiors' orders. No one knows what's happening, and the High Command is out of touch with the reality we face here. We're stuck in the mud, surrounded by Soviets, and every day is a fight for survival. No one tells us the truth about what's going on, and I don't know how much longer we can hold on. and it got worse. The Hell of Stalingrad, the last stand. Deluded by the propaganda and intoxicated by the early success, the German soldiers were sure they were going to win easily, and as the German Sixth Army approached Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, they believed the final victory was just around the corner. By January 1943, it all changed. The Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, fought for every room of every building against the Soviets, who had nowhere to retreat to, and fought desperately to save the city. The German soldiers felt trapped in the city, and they became increasingly discontent. In later years, Private Kohler remembered, "In the beginning, we thought the city would fall within days. But as soon as we started moving through the streets, it became clear we were facing something different. The Russians didn't give up an inch. Every inch of Stalingrad was fought for, and we were losing." Also, the winter of 1942-43 was one of the coldest on record, and the German soldiers found themselves suffering from frostbite and exposure. They were hungry and became outnumbered. The fear of losing increased, especially the fear of the unknown. Many of the soldiers were well aware of what their colleagues did to the Soviets, and many were still indoctrinated by the propaganda and expected the worst from the enemies. Either way, they were terrified. One of the soldiers who first wrote about victory before Christmas soon changed the story when he wrote to his mother that although things were not as before, they still held the line. A little bit later, he continued about the unbearable cold, frozen ground, deep snow, small food rations, starvation, complete and utter isolation, and fear. He seemed like he lost hope. This private's destiny still remains unknown, and all that is left of him are the letters left in the military post service. In the final days before the encirclement of Stalingrad was complete, the once proud Sixth Army found itself in a hopeless position. For the soldiers, there were only two options: death or capture. This took a significant toll on these young men who were facing the worst. By the end of January 1943, the Sixth Army was decimated. More than 200,000 German soldiers had been either killed, wounded, or captured. Of those who survived, many became prisoners of war in the Soviet Union for years to come. The German progress in war was over, and all these soldiers had to face the new reality of retreat, death, and surrender. The date is January 31st. Men are close to exhaustion. We are encircled, cold, and starving. Rumors are that Paulus has surrendered, but many officers are denying it. This morning we burned our last maps and documents. A Soviet soldier shouted at us to come out, promising food and medical help. Some of our wounded already crawled out. I am ashamed, but I want to live. These words from Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann from the 94th Infantry Division showed the despair. Hoffmann was just one of almost 100,000 captured after the battle, and his fate remains unknown. The rumors were true. Paulus surrendered on that day. The time has come for the German soldiers to face the consequences of their nation's actions, especially towards the Soviet civilians. Between war and humanity, faces in the rubble. When German forces entered the Soviet territory, they encountered first the Soviet army and later the Soviet civilians. Although some minority of them welcomed the Nazis as friends and liberators, most of them were hostile, afraid, and desperate. This was quite a surprise for the German soldiers, as they were expecting much friendlier people. Just like the Nazi propaganda promoted nationalism, the Soviet counterpart did the same to their people. Most of the Soviet people hated the foreign army in their lands and didn't want anything to do with them, and tried to make their time in Russia as difficult as possible. These civilians shared the common goal of surviving. These people weren't a horde of mindless Bolshevik zombies. They were just farmers, similar to those in Germany. A large part of the soldiers tried to ignore villagers while passing by, but most of them noticed terrified children and old people who were afraid of the uncertain future. Soon, these relations became worse, since the German occupation of Soviet territory brought about widespread suffering. German troops, under orders to clear out areas for military use, would often confiscate food supplies, burn crops, and destroy homes. Provisional punishments, mass deportations, forced labors, and executions became regular. These crimes against the civilians were completely legal since the Barbarossa decree, and in the guidelines for the troops, it is clearly stated that the Soviet civilians are not entitled to any legal protection and should be executed for any resistance without any repercussions. Soon the hunger plan, named after his architect Herbert Bacher, followed. According to the plan, the food should be taken away from the Soviet Union and brought to Germany, which led to widespread starvation in the Soviet villages. Young Soviet people were sent to Germany as slave labor, but the most harsh penalty was for the villages suspected of hiding partisans. These villages were burned, and the population was often gathered in the village church and locked to be burned alive. And the Jews suffered an even worse fate. Due to Nazi racial ideology, the mass executions started almost immediately. During the post-war interrogation in Nuremberg, a captured SS officer confessed what he saw and did in the Babi Yar near Kiev during the most infamous executions in 1941. The Jews had to undress on the edge of the ravine. They stood there in groups, men, women, and children. Then they were driven forward and shot in the back of the head. Some fell inside alive. The ground was moving even hours later. I saw it. I will never forget the sound. As the war progressed and the situation worsened, the brutality became even worse, although most of the soldiers were reluctant but still executed these murders. It started to affect their minds, and the awful Holocaust plan of gas chambers was constructed to protect the soldiers. But there is a small number of documented stories of sympathetic German soldiers towards the civilians. One of them was Wilhelm Langbein from the 6th Army. When his unit marched near Kharkiv in 1941, this episode happened. We had entered a village that looked abandoned, but inside a small wooden house we found an old woman, her daughter, and 2 grandchildren. They were terrified of us at first. We had no orders about them, and I told my comrades to lower their rifles. The Soviet civilians were grateful. The babushka gave me a scarf she had knitted. I still have it. Her daughter baked bread with whatever flour they had left. We did not speak the same language, but at that moment it didn't matter. In a post-war interview in 1982, Langbein showed the scarf to the TV crew. Langbein, like many others, struggled to come to terms with what he witnessed and what happened during the war, and his post-war life wasn't good. With a shaken mental state, many turned to alcohol, some ended up in the institutions, and it is still not researched enough what happened to all the soldiers after the war. Pills of power, the chemical war within. Most of the soldiers in Operation Barbarossa were still young men, although many of them were already experienced soldiers. Still, it was the first time for them to experience a combat this brutal. The whole campaign was the most demanding, physically and mentally. Long marches through the inhospitable terrain, constant fear for their lives, and scenes that remained forever engraved in their minds created an atmosphere of exhaustion, stress, and fear. The Nazi regime also thought on that, and that's why they provided their soldiers with the chemical help to bypass these problems, and the answer was Pervitin. Pervitin was a German drug brand based on methamphetamine. It was distributed to the German troops at the outset of Operation Barbarossa. Effects are well familiar and were thought could help the German war effort. The soldiers had increased alertness and suppressed fatigue, and they had the energy to continue fighting despite the physical and mental conditions. The name for it, when soldiers talked about it, was the miracle pill, since it made soldiers much more ready for the battles. One German soldier, known only as Hans H., explained how he felt when he got the pill. "When I first got my hands on Pervitin, it was almost a feeling of invincibility. The long stretches of fatigue were gone, and we could march for days." The German High Command encouraged the use of Pervitin not only as a tool to improve the soldiers' performance, but also as a way to sustain the momentum of the offensive. According to historian Norman Ohler, Pervitin was distributed in pill form and sometimes as a liquid. Thousands of pills were produced daily, and they were shipped to the front lines, especially to panzer divisions, motorized infantry, and Luftwaffe pilots. In 1940, over 35 million doses of Pervitin were produced, and by 1941, it was already being issued to soldiers in large quantities. German doctors were instructed to issue Pervitin to soldiers during long operations or when they were about to be sent on a march. Soon, some soldiers would get addicted to it, but the powers that be were more concerned with keeping morale high and the army moving than the long-term consequences. For many soldiers, the continued use of Pervitin led to a growing sense of mental fatigue and mental problems. The drug masked the effects of exhaustion, allowing the soldiers to keep moving and fighting, but the exhaustion remained inside. These angry and agitated soldiers were more prone to committing crimes. In later records, Hans H. claimed that he felt changed. After a while, I noticed the edge. The paranoia set in, and it got harder to concentrate. We couldn't sleep, and I started feeling disconnected from my comrades. Similar patterns were noticed by Wilhelm Prüller, a Wehrmacht chaplain. The young men would take the pills before an operation or during a march. They did not know the side effects, but I saw how they began to unravel after weeks of continuous use. Their eyes were hollow. There was no sleep, no peace, just a constant drive to keep moving. And when the effect wore off, they had feelings of depression, anxiety, and a sense of disorientation. The long-term effects of Pervitin on the soldiers were even more devastating. They became drug addicts, and their dependency continued after the war if they managed to survive that long. As the war progressed, the German army began to realize that the overuse of stimulants like Pervitin was creating a new set of problems. The soldiers who had once been seen as invincible, the dark times lay ahead, and they were now suffering from burnout, depression, and a host of other psychological issues. It became evident in the later stages of the war what the use of these drugs did to the users, as more and more soldiers showed signs of exhaustion and mental instability, and the Soviet army started their unstoppable counteroffensive. Fleeing the furnace, the bitter retreat and the war of lies. By early 1943, the once unstoppable advance into Soviet territory became a desperate retreat. The Soviet counteroffensive made glorious conquering soldiers into groups of fleeing men fighting not for their country, the master race or the new world, but the men fighting for their lives and a chance to reach their homeland alive. One of the most brutal retreats took place after the Battle of Stalingrad. The ones who were not immediately captured tried to flee, and Heinz Guderian remembered that chaos. We were not prepared for this. The frost was brutal, and the Red Army pursued us relentlessly. There was no plan, just fleeing in panic, and there was no real help from the Luftwaffe. In The Blood-Red Snow, memoirs of Günter Koschorek, he most vividly remembers the despair of the common soldiers, the same ones who were so proud when they entered the Soviet Union, drunken with the idea of glory. We were reduced to little more than a disorganized mob. I saw men break down in tears, utterly defeated. Others were scavenging for food, desperate for anything that could sustain them. They abandoned the equipment, leaving it to the Soviets. The wounded suffered a similar fate. But the worst was when the reality of getting caught became evident. In the journals of Hans Roth, discovered after his death, this horror can be felt. We fled, not as soldiers, but as broken men. The Russians were everywhere, and there was no safe place to hide. Despite all these stories from the front and the reality of the situation, the Nazi leader in Berlin lived in a delusion of victory, commanding divisions that didn't exist anymore. But that was not enough. Until the last breath of the Third Reich, they tried to maintain that illusion among the people using propaganda. While soldiers in the East were freezing, starving, and fleeing, the propaganda machine continued to spin a narrative of victory, strength, and resilience. In his diaries, Goebbels wrote of the great successes of German forces, even as reports from the front told a very different story. We must keep morale high. Goebbels decided to portray the retreat as a temporary setback, a necessary maneuver to regroup and strike back. Although it was portrayed as a strategy, the soldiers who were caught in the middle of all that knew what was really happening. In one of his final letters from the East, before his disappearance in the summer of 1944, Private Hans Roth felt frustrated and angry because of the propaganda and all the lies. They keep saying we are winning, but I haven't had a hot meal in weeks, and I'm living in a trench covered in snow. If we're winning, then why are we running? These words became more common among the soldiers, and even the officers didn't report that pessimism, they were sharing it. Günter Koschorek talked to one of his fellow soldiers. He said to me, "Do you think we're really winning?" I could see the desperation in his eyes. He didn't believe the reports anymore, not after what we'd seen. I think he knew, deep down, that it was over. Many soldiers began to openly ridicule the information being broadcasted, humiliated by the lies. In private letters, soldiers mocked the propaganda, acknowledging that they were aware of their increasingly dire situation. For those at the front, it was clear that the promises of triumph were nothing but lies. The only thing in front of them was the final defense of Germany and Berlin, and they felt betrayed by their leaders who were refusing to accept the truth and left to die in vain in such a hopeless conflict. The soldiers of Operation Barbarossa were at the same time the aggressors and the victims. They were a part of the aggressive army that committed unspeakable crimes, but were also victims of their own government. Mobilized with promises of glory and victory, they marched into the east, driven by propaganda, duty, and an ideological war machine. Though many were young and naive, the individual soldiers acted completely opposite. In the early stages, many soldiers believed in their mission, but as the war dragged on and the true horrors of the Eastern Front unfolded, they started questioning the lies they were fed and the brutalities they were forced to commit. Some were reluctant, others complicit, but each faced the harsh reality of their choices. By the time they fled in the face of Soviet counter-offensives, it was clear. They were not just pawns in a larger game, they were active participants in a war of aggression that destroyed lives on both sides. Their story is one of moral conflict, struggle, and the painful consequences of war.